Hey, welcome everyone to the podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Ross. Now, generally, we're not super time sensitive with a lot of these, but I just wanted to introduce before we do this segment that we're actually recording this on February the 19th with potential tariffs looming between Canada and the US, and that's our biggest concern. I wanted to kind of time mark this so that you know that we're trying to be timely here at Chat Media and the Great Canadian Aftermarket Podcast. So, having said that, with me today is Todd Campau, S&P Global at Aftermarket Practice Lead. Now, he did an excellent presentation last year in 2024 at the AIA Canada conference, talking about the structure of the fleets between Canada and the US and the differences, and some of the flows of vehicles too, which has an impact on kind of the overall fleet. So I've invited him here today to talk about kind of what the aftermarket is to make of all of these changing trade relationships, potentially changing trade relationships, impact on the aftermarket, and what we're kind of supposed to make of all of this. Todd, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Andrew. Happy to be here.
So I guess that's my question. I mean, there's a lot going on in an already fairly dynamic, just normal state of a market, but what should we be paying attention to as aftermarket professionals, and what are the potential impacts on Canada's aftermarket and I guess the aftermarket at large?
Well, that's a really interesting question, I think, and it really is changing almost daily, isn't it? I just read this morning, that the Trump administration has talked a little bit more specifically about automotive tariffs now. And I think the really interesting thing from an aftermarket perspective is understanding what will impact the aftermarket versus a new vehicle tariff. And I don't think there's a lot of clarity on that yet, but I do think in the aftermarket space, it's incumbent on us to be proactive because we have heard some even raw material tariffs that are going to be implemented for US and Canada trade as it is. And so I think you have to be proactive. I would encourage not to be governed by fear by any means, but being proactive and keeping up on the news and planning for your business in more of maybe a midterm range if you can. I think, we can talk about a little bit more in the podcast maybe as we go along, but, we've already seen from the first wave of threatened tariffs that sometimes it's a means to an end, and sometimes it's just trying to balance trade. I think there's components of both that the administration's after, but picking through which is which is going to be the challenge over the next probably 6 months or more. And so, if you can plan a little bit more longer term maybe than you normally do, it might behoove the aftermarket to have a little more inventory on the shelf before the tariffs. I don't think you can plan to weather the tariffs, but maybe just to get through the period of time where we have a little bit of uncertainty about what's happening, it might be beneficial.
Right. I mean, I remember, when the first tariff threat became an actual real live, executive order. I went and bought an extra pound of coffee, a couple of pounds of coffee, because they said that was going to go up a lot. Now it hasn't happened yet, but and that's the kind of thing. But there's a limit, right? I mean, you can't just every distributor out there, I'm sure, will say, we want to kind of mitigate the impacts by maybe buying forward a little bit and bringing in some of those orders as we can. But there are limits. You can't just buy up the market entirely, but both for the reasons of space alone, never mind financial resources. And boy, oh boy, if they didn't come through and you got stuck with a bunch of inventory that
Right.
now you might have another set of self-created issues that you might have to deal with. But yeah, sure, for sure, having strategy to kind of mitigate some of those, right? It makes a lot of sense.
Well, and I think the first thing is if you know which of your products ahead of time, we're in the period now where there's a few weeks left before the next threat of tariffs come through around the 1st of March. So there's not a lot of time, but hopefully in the past 10, 12 days, you've been really digging into your inventory. and your order points to understand what's at risk of being tariffed, what's coming directly from the US. I mean, that is the challenge here is, you know, I think each industry would say this, but maybe more in the automotive industry than many other industries. We've had an integrated supply chain for aftermarket and new vehicles from US, Canada, Mexico for a long time. And so unwinding that is a challenge. But certainly I would encourage organizations to try to be aware of what could be at risk. And then you can be more targeted. And as you said, you can't buy a year's supply, but maybe you can weather, you know, an additional 30 days of supply or something. If again, you have the capital to do that for some key products. But yeah, I would not go again. I think pragmatism should rule the day. At times the administration, as we all know from the first Trump administration, Trump will say things to get, you know, it's the art of the deal all over again. You know, some of it is to get something else that he wants. Some of it is real. And so you don't want to go too far either way. Pragmatism should be key.
For sure. Now, you know, again, as you mentioned that, you know, as of just within the last, I can't think, 24 to 48 hours, you know, a number of other measures have been spoken of. I don't know if they're actually going to come to fruition regarding vehicle tariffs and European vehicle tariffs and other, you know, I mean, it's a fast-paced fire hose of you know, potential initiatives, right? But you know, I guess one of the things that occurs to me, and you sort of alluded to it at the beginning, is there is a lot of talk just in the general press about the impact on new vehicle production. You know, that seems to be a go-to for a lot of the conversations. Those of us in the aftermarket, which is, you know, almost underground in a way, in the sense of, you know, what most people in their daily lives think about, you know, is impacted as well, right? And the impact of what these things might have on vehicles, you know, the vehicles in operation, right? And people's desire or ability or willingness to lay down their cash for a new vehicle in, I think, what can be fairly called uncertain times, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things I love about the aftermarket, and especially in North America, the global aftermarket as well. But here in North America, the aftermarket has proved to be extremely resilient. We really are impacted by the confluence of factors that we see over time. And you know, when you look at a vehicle fleet that has an average age of over 10 years in Canada, you know, it's closing in on 11 years of age. A relatively large fleet when you compare it to new vehicle sales. You know, there's 27-ish million vehicles on the road in Canada for passenger cars, light trucks, with less than 2 million a year new sold. You know, these new vehicle ripple effects take some time to really impact the aftermarket. But yes, the tariffs are unique because it will impact us in the aftermarket space on products that are coming in. When you think about the consumer, I think the uncertainty will have more impact on new vehicle sales right now because, you know, if it's the difference of putting out $60,000 or $70,000 for a new vehicle versus, you know, having to spend an additional maybe $100 on a repair, you know, that's going to be a question that's very easy for consumers to answer. They're going to go with the repair during the uncertain times. And so while the aftermarket is going to see effect, I think it's going to be muted for the aftermarket. I think we do need to be, you know, again, pragmatic. We need to be judicious about how we manage our books and make sure that we're not losing money from the tariffs. And that unfortunately it's going to get passed along to the consumer. Everybody knows that. But doing our best to try to weather the storm, because I think it's a I wouldn't say it's a tailwind, but it's not a headwind for the aftermarket either. I think it, you know, will be relatively neutral, and it could be a tailwind if it's a strong headwind to new vehicle sales.
Right, right. I mean,
So
as you say, that might take a little while to come to fruition, and you know, a month-long shortening of or shrinking
yeah,
of, you know, new vehicle sales isn't going to do it. But if it's persistent for a year or more, then as we saw during the pandemic inflicted supply chain issues, people just hung on to their vehicles because they wouldn't or couldn't replace them. We also saw a massive rise in the valuations of used vehicles too, which was, again, even people with older used vehicles looking to change up to a newer used vehicle it was a significant jump for a while, right? So,
Yeah, and I would add that's one area where I think questions about the tariffs will come into play as well. You alluded to the presentation I gave at the AIA conference last year. And I've been continuing to monitor the export of vehicles from Canada into the US. We don't know yet if the tariffs will impact those. I would assume not because it's a used vehicle, but they still could charge an import tariff on a used vehicle, which would have probably an effect on the vehicles leaving Canada and coming into the US. Because as I noted at the conference, I believe one of the things that enable that or encourage growth in exports from Canada to the US is the strength of the US dollar. If we impose a 25% tariff on used vehicles crossing the border, all of a sudden that strength of the US dollar dries up almost completely, and the benefit of importing from Canada pretty much goes away, which for the aftermarket, now this is one of those good things, bad things, and I think that's what to look for in the tariffs. And I think the aftermarket has that capability to find good in a rough situation. That's one of the reasons we're so resilient. If the tariffs help to keep some more vehicles in that sweet spot of aftermarket repair, because we're still seeing that the average vehicles leaving Canada to the US are around 8 years of age. It's getting back towards 8 years of age. So there's a lot of very quality aftermarket prime vehicles that leave Canada and go to the US right now. If the tariffs slowed that would be a benefit for the Canadian aftermarket.
That's interesting. I find I had without sort of looking at data as you do, had assumed that it would be more late model used vehicles leaving the country than as you say, the average being 8, which is a bit older than I would have thought. So that's certainly an impact. I do recall also from your presentation that there was a period, I think when the exchange rate was particularly advantageous for U.S. Used vehicle buyers, mostly I guess through auctions and whatnot, and bringing them down. That the Canadian fleet actually shrunk a little bit, and maybe more than a little bit, which is something that we're not used to hearing about. We assume kind of that it's always growing, and that's not an assumption that's really based in necessarily in persistent fact, is it?
Yeah, again, that becomes looking at the fleet from a North American perspective versus Canadian perspective, because you're correct. The fleet did shrink in Canada and those vehicles appeared in the US, and then some US vehicles went to Mexico. And so the effect is really hard to measure when you look at high level numbers. But yeah, when you start to separate these countries with tariffs, then it's more apparent. And that time you're thinking about where it really jumped was the pandemic. And there was somewhat favorable exchange rate, but there was also a dearth of used vehicles in the US, and new vehicles weren't available either. And so you had a small time period there where US consumers were willing to pay even a premium for a Canadian used vehicle. And so I think that obviously stimulated the exports into the US. I think also the other thing that we're seeing is, I think this is, I don't want to coin a term here, so to speak, but it's almost the Carvana effect, that Carvana has taught us that we're capable of moving vehicles across the country or across North America, let's say, for a relatively small fee. Buy a vehicle in Vancouver and move it to Detroit, and there are people that just do that now, and so I think it's created, or let's say it's removed a barrier, and created a capability that we didn't have before the pandemic, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's certainly, in everybody's own experience, the visibility of seeing vehicles on the other side of the continent of what's available, particularly on the used front, is that just didn't exist before. You would have to go to your local, either dealer's used car lot and see what was around, or look for private sales in even for a long time, with tools, local advertising tools, and through magazines, or through flyers, or even when it went online, it was still really focused on local, right? And that's just really gone. I mean, I bought a vehicle. It was still in the same province, but it was. I'm in Northern Ontario, and it was in Niagara Falls.
Yeah. Yeah.
And at the same time, I was looking at vehicles all across, and whether they would go buy US or buy this or buy that, and that's played out, I think safe to say, millions of times a year, right, by individuals.
Absolutely. And I think, when you start to dive further into the impact of the tariffs, obviously a vehicle exported from Canada and into the US for a manufacturer that is in, all parts of North America or global, the impact is maybe lessened depending on where they manufacture the part, but especially, a lot of what we've been talking about here, whether it be tariffs or vehicle import and export, when you really get down into the distributor, the service center, the jobber, that's where it really becomes, much larger from a size of impact perspective of vehicles that you didn't, maybe weren't in your market that are now, or vehicles that were in your market that you were planning to be able to support repairs for that are no longer there.
Right.
So that's where the, it'll probably be a little bit of an art form for a little while before the science can really catch up to what the impacts of all the tariff talk and everything else has on the marketplace.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, for a long time, I've been at this for a little bit. We sort of look at the demand curve in the aftermarket, and we see the new car sales, and we see that cyclical thing where you have a big mountain of new vehicles moving through its ages, and kind of visualizing that mountain moving into its prime aftermarket years. And I think the assumption is generally that that's what plays out in the aftermarket, notwithstanding a little bit of reduction if there's scrappage, vehicles get crashed and totaled, but not seem to be super significant. But if we start seeing large numbers of vehicles that would be coming into their prime aftermarket years, just not there, especially if it's in, I don't know. I mean, much of Canada's population is not too far from the U.S. border, right? So it's fairly easy to come and move a lot of vehicles out of Ontario, say from southwestern Ontario, and those, as you say, those just be gone. Quick question: how many vehicles move from Canada to the U.S. in any kind of given year, or quarters, or however you want?
So it's been a little bit chaotic the past few years. Obviously, there were a lot more during the pandemic, and then 2022 with the supply chain. We've been looking at the numbers for 2023 and 2024, actually, as I'm preparing for another presentation on the Canadian market here, actually next week. It's down, but I would still say in general, I didn't look at the aggregated numbers. You're still talking about roughly 1%. It's about 250, 300,000 vehicles in a typical year. It does look like the exchange rate is trending downward. We don't actually forecast it to stay that way here at S&P Global. We've obviously got an arm that does forecasting on financials and things like that. They expect it to kind of stay a little bit elevated, so we don't expect it to keep coming down. But it's coming down a little, and the exports from Canada to the U.S. have come down a little bit still. But I'd say right now we're still in that 300-ish, 250 to 300,000 range. A typical year prior to the pandemic, when the exchange rates were a little bit more steady, it seemed to be below that 250,000 number typically. Not a lot. It was still probably 180,000 on the low end and 230, 240 on the high end in a typical year for the 3 or 4 years leading up to the pandemic. So not a lot, but when you consider that's 1% of the fleet each year, when you tack on maybe you're getting 5 or 6% new vehicles coming in, you're getting 4 or 5% of vehicles leaving via scrappage
Yep.
for, expiry, crash, and all those things. And then you got another 1% that's leaving to the US. I mean, when you start to see those numbers, that's why you saw a reduction in the vehicle fleet in Canada there for a couple of years.
Right, right. Kind of amazing. It's I remember doing my own kind of back of the envelope figuring on it and being really surprised at how little the overall vehicle fleet in Canada can grow in any given time when you start factoring in these elements, and obviously that has an additive effect over time, but it's super interesting, and again, not an element that I think gets nearly enough attention when we're talking about the aftermarket vehicle population and all that stuff. But I mean, in all of these dynamics, Todd. I mean, I guess I'm going to forgive myself if it gives me a bit of a headache sometimes. But like what do we do? To help mitigate some of these impacts in with all this uncertainty, and what is the kind of aggregate outlook?
I think really just staying informed is critical. And so, you don't want to dive into the news rabbit hole more frequently than you have to, but you do need to identify and, skim the news and see what's important to your business. And obviously anything right now with tariffs and automotive, with things that are going on with the manufacturers, we've heard about some mergers that could have happened that didn't happen. All those things that contribute to the automotive space, it's very important to stay informed. I think the thing I learned personally, and I've been in this industry for a while, I just kicked off year number 23. So I finished 22 just a couple of weeks ago. So I've been in the aftermarket for 23 years, 22 years, 23, right in that neighborhood. And the biggest thing I've learned just in the past 4 or 5 years is that it really is a confluence of factors. And that is what makes the aftermarket resilient. That's what also makes it very difficult to see, the hockey stick growth that everybody loves. That's not indicative of the aftermarket very often. It does happen here and there when there's new technologies and things like that come into play, or serious issues with certain key vehicles. But really, it's a relatively resilient, not super high growth, not super low reduction, because there are so many factors that build into it. And then in the end, it's a consumer thing. And, I think the thing I saw in the pandemic that I thought was really cool was consumers across North America, voted with their pocketbooks that they needed vehicles. Like, we've seen the fleet grow in the US, we've seen the Canada fleet stay steady, mainly because there's a lot of exports going to the US at the very moment, but there's healthy new vehicle sales still continuing in Canada, and it's growing, and we expect it to grow for the next couple of years again. And so what you just see is see shifts in the age of the population based on these external factors. But consumers still want vehicles, and so there's still going to be a vibrant aftermarket. I think things like right to repair are critical because vehicles are changing. And so staying informed, staying active, staying involved in groups like AIA, where they're advocating for the marketplace as a whole, I think are invaluable. So I would encourage all those things. And again, kind of going back to what we said at the start of our conversation, being pragmatic. You do have to not bury your head in the sand and do nothing, but don't also go out and, create a toilet paper effect where we buy all of the parts up,
right,
and have 12 years of parts on our shelves that we're not going to sell for the rest of the decade. So it's kind of being in the in-between and picking through what is really important now, what it creates an opportunity in the short term, and what sets you up in the long term to be successful. And it really is, it's really going to boil down to small degree shifts in certain areas to make sure you support your business through the uncertainty. And you bolster the areas that need a little bit of support, and let the rest kind of flow, because consumers have shown that the vehicle fleet is going to continue to flow. So you don't want to change anything too drastically based on external stimuli, I would say.
Yeah.
So yeah, stay informed. I think your podcast is obviously critical, a critical component of that. And you know, a lot of the articles that you see floating across, if you're not getting them in your emails, you know, start finding ways to connect with some of the articles on our specific space. I'm sure, you know, AIA and other places have means for you to connect automotive news channels of all different sorts. So I think
No,
that's
for
the
sure.
tool of being informed.
Yeah, I mean, great advice for everyone out there. You know, stay informed. Don't stick your head in the sand, because this stuff is coming whether you like it or not. But also be really calm and practical about it and rational. I saw in a recent quarterly report from a major distributor saying that they have shown and believe in the past that the aftermarket behaves in a rational fashion. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks everyone for listening to the podcast. Thanks Todd for being the guest. Super informative. I learned a whole bunch of things. You know, everybody stay informed, stay with it. Don't panic. The aftermarket is here to stay. Thanks again, everyone. Talk to you next time.